Hey there, and welcome to Work Dope, a podcast on the messiness and the potential of humans at work. I'm Linda Stacy, and I'm a corporate sellout who likes to think of herself as a corporate innovator. And I think that working in corporate America doesn't have to suck, though admittedly, it often does. By some statistics, up to 80% of the workforce are unsatisfied in their work. And on the flip side here, the paradox is that folks are expecting more and more to create meaning and purpose out of who they are in their lives at work. The pandemic, the Great Resignation, the Great Regret, and now quiet quitting, all of these have forced us to take a look at what quality of life and culture really means for people inside of organizations. I do think that business and organizational structure can be really cool. I think that building things and solving real world problems, creation, all of this is fundamental to the best parts of what it means to be human. This is how we embrace human potential, or at least one way. In this episode, I'm chatting with Yennie Rautenberg-Loya. Yennie's firm is Rautenberg Coaching, and she offers bilingual English and Spanish executive coaching, specializing in developing leaders of diverse backgrounds and enabling inclusive, collaborative work environments. Yennie immigrated to the U.S. employed as an adult working in the corporate space, and she worked in marketing and communications for a Fortune 500 tech company before turning to coaching full-time in 2018. As with most guests, Yennie and I talk about navigating corporate workspaces, and in this episode, we talk about doing that as a person of color and someone who doesn't have English as their first language. We get into some really interesting things. We talk about mental barriers and stories that we create around who we are. We talk about perceptions of leadership. Yennie shares some of her own experiences from corporate and a few experiences of coaching people who are leaders in corporate. She also shares some feelings around all of this, that there are no formulas. It's complicated dealing with humans at work, but that we have to start somewhere. Note that this episode was recorded at the start of Hispanic Heritage Month, and I am posting it towards the end of Hispanic Heritage Month. There's also a few points in this episode where I'm going to come back at the outro and dive in a little bit deeper. Stay tuned. I hope you enjoy the episode. Good morning, Yennie. How are you today? Welcome to Work Dope.
Thank you. I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you. I appreciate your time. This is going to be fantastic. So prior to us saying hello, I have told the group formally what you do, your formal bio, but I always like to ask people personally. Well, one question might be, what do you tell people you do when you're at a cocktail party? Is there a way that you kind of break that down, nuts and bolts?
Yeah, it's always a strange question to answer, actually, to be succinct and to be specific about what people do. I guess the best way to put it is that I work with people to empower them to do different things. One is advancing their careers, to advance personally too, right? Because it's hard to advance in your career if you don't have certain things of your personal life figured out. That idea of, oh, this is my personal life and this is my professional life. I think that the pandemic has shown that everything is mixed and intertwined.
Mm-hmm.
So when people ask me, what do you do? Well, I work with people, I work with organizations to create more inclusive work environments on one side. That's kind of the ultimate goal. And I work with individuals to make sure that they have the tools, the mindsets to do whatever they need to do to advance, right? And that might include how to build a sense of belonging, how to develop certain skills that are more like soft skills, like emotional intelligence, communication, leadership, resiliency, and how to work with each other better. So that's not too short, but that's kind of the gist of it.
Yeah. So there's so much in there, but I'll just call on one thing. You say that you can help people increase their own sense of belonging. Did I get that right? Or am I interpreting that correctly? I'd like for you to share about your own background and having come to this country, the United States, later in life, and how that's impacted what you do and how you help people with their sense of belonging. And in our earlier conversation, you also mentioned having gone to a German school in Mexico. And I'm sure that too, just all of those inflection points from your own life and how that impacts. But again, going back to how does that all feed into how you help people feel like they belong?
Yeah. This sense of belonging is something that it's so interesting because it's not something tangible, right? And what I've seen is that a lot of companies are investing and are developing programs for people to feel that they belong. And that's great. That needs to be there, right? There's need to be a space for people to step into so they can show up in a way that is authentic and that feels right as an individual. The part of that it's tricky is that it's an experience that we have as human beings, and it's a need that we have, right? Like as human beings we are designed to belong to something bigger to ourselves than ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And what it's interesting is that we do all kinds of things to belong, but really it's more about fitting in or adjusting or
Mm-hmm.
assimilating,
Mm-hmm.
see how I can, there's an environment there that I need to fit in.
Mm-hmm.
And the more we try to do that to fit in, the more we disconnect of our own self.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really hard to feel that you belong in a space that you're not being yourself. You're just adjusting to be able to fit. It's kind of complex, right? So um, what I have found, and I've worked with a lot of different people, is that in different backgrounds, different levels, different skin color, like you name it, right? Like different individuals. And we all deal with this thing of, I want to belong to something. At the same time, I want to be my own self. I want to be an individual.
Mm-hmm.
That in itself creates a little bit of friction.
Mm-hmm.
And then I always say, like, you cannot belong anywhere and you don't if you don't belong within yourself, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we all have, it doesn't matter what is our background, we all have things from our past, from how we grew up, how we, like the school, the family,
Mm-hmm.
our whatever we came from, right?
Yeah.
That we have history through our life that has impacted that sense of belonging.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important, I think, to work on that as much as
Mm-hmm.
it is to be prepared to step into a work environment where you can be yourself and authentic. Is how are you going to be yourself and authentic if you have this baggage, right?
Yeah.
Like carrying from your past. And so it's a little bit of like a healing process,
Mm-hmm.
a be well grounded on who you are.
Mm-hmm.
What are your accomplishments? What are your skills? Like, who are
Mm-hmm.
you as a person? And that is one of the hardest questions to answer, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you take away what you do and where you come from, is like, who are you?
Yeah.
It's more of a philosophical question, but there are things that you can do to kind of close chapters of your past,
Mm-hmm.
embrace them,
Mm-hmm.
and then make them part of who you are today.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that all of that is what you bring in. So if you want to belong in a space, you need to embrace that and to bring it with pride and with love, right? And just, this is who I am.
Yeah.
So that is the work that I do. It's not psychology, of course. I'm an executive and leadership coach, and
Mm-hmm.
I focus my work in topics related to inclusion and diversity.
Mm-hmm.
But it's that is like we need to also grow and prepare and evolve as human beings to be able to bring the best of ourselves to our work.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So this is fabulous. So you work with people, it sounds like, almost to do an inventory in some ways, in order for them to understand themselves better, right? And to
That
embrace themselves.
yes.
When you were saying fit in, I kept thinking fix, like correct this part of myself
Oh
so that
yeah.
I fit into this mold that I think they'd prefer me to be in, which doesn't really allow you to bring the best of yourself if you're constantly worried about parts that you need to be hiding or not showing or something.
One thing I think that it's super relevant what you're saying, right? Is that we we grew up, and I mean, I don't know if the newer younger generations that has changed, but in general we have grown up in a system that requires us to to fit certain molds
Yes.
and to fix what's wrong.
Yes.
So we don't come from an environment, and positive psychology is trying to change that, right? How
Right.
to focus on our strengths
Yeah.
and come from a strengths-based
Mm-hmm.
approach.
Mm-hmm.
And there's science, there's studies and research that shows that when you are using your strengths, you can be
Right.
way more
Right.
effective than if you're
Yes.
trying to overcome or fix something that it's wrong,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I also feel like this doesn't mean don't gain skills. I think that's part of it
Exactly.
too, because I am someone who, whether by nature or nurture, did not grow up with fantastic skills around productivity and being able to kind of keep all my things together and
Mhm.
organized. Although that might just be an internal story I've been telling myself for the last many,
Yeah,
many years. But I
yeah,
do know that when I worked on improving those skills, it allowed my actual strengths to shine. And I think that there's a lot wrapped into this, that we do need to be clear on the best of what we're bringing, but then how do we kind of shore that up? We can learn other things. We're not going to like decide that we don't that we don't have to gain new skills or something like that.
yeah.
I
And it's a
Yeah.
it's a mindset, right? It's
Yeah.
what's known as growth mindset, and
Yeah.
it's like there's nothing for you to fix about
Right.
you or me, or we
Right.
don't have to fix anything.
Right.
And that is a different approach, because if I am trying to overcome all the time something that quote unquote it's wrong with me,
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
mindset there
Mm-hmm.
is almost like it's really challenging, is not empowering, is self-defeating
Right.
almost.
Right.
But
Right.
if you are clear about what are your strengths, what you're good at, and then like you can be well grounded, those
Mm-hmm.
are, I call them anchors, right?
Yeah.
Like those are
Mm-hmm.
anchors that can hold you in a place,
Mm-hmm.
and then you can add to that. You can, but the approach, the mindset is different, because you're not
Mm-hmm.
trying to fix something, you're trying to add something.
Yes, yes, yes. I love that. Or
Mhm.
bring something out more or something like that. I love the
Yes.
idea of anchors. And if there were young people listening to this podcast and they're new to their career,
Mm.
I think it's just something to begin to be aware of, that like you kind of pay attention, what are my things? And I do think that I would guess that some of these anchors have roots that predate the actual career. I mean, I
Of
know there
course.
are parts of me that definitely were there when I was 13,
Yeah. Yeah.
that still come through in some ways in my career.
Yeah.
So that's fantastic. And I know you do work sometimes with a specific population, and we
Hmm.
are entering Hispanic Heritage Month.
Yes.
Yes. And I'd
Yes.
love to have you share some of what you've common themes that you've noticed in
Yeah.
the populations, especially as it's linked back to this ability to own who you are and where you come from,
Hmm.
and bring the best of that, and to create your sense of belonging, and how that all plays in. What are the themes that you
Yeah.
see?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, being an immigrant myself, right? That I'm Mexican, as you mentioned.
Mhm.
My last name is my last name from birth. My grandfather was German. That's why I went to the German school, answering your previous question.
Yep.
And from my mom's side, my grandfather is was indigenous from the northern part of Mexico, from the Sierra Tarahumara,
Mhm.
which it's a community that is very well known because they run a lot, like bare feet,
Okay.
in like they're known as the runners, right?
Okay.
So just to give some context, so my both of my grandfathers come from very different places,
Oh yeah.
and from there a lot of my upbringing was with those two perspectives, is like the German side and the Mexican side, and how those intertwine, etc.
Mhm.
So that part of my identity was very, very present for me my entire life. And I mean, I don't look what it's known as a German person, right? Like I'm not tall, I'm not like first clean or blue eyes or blonde. So I never felt that I fit in in the German school, private school, of course, from that aspect, very privileged. And with a lot of people that were very wealthy, we were not wealthy. We would just, I mean, we just could pay the school, right?
Yeah.
But we were not wealthy at all. So I grew up with this constant navigation of like, okay, so am I German? Am I Mexican? Where do I fit? I didn't fit with my friends in my neighborhood. I didn't fit with my mom's family. And like, it was always that fitting in, which was problematic. And then I come to the US when I was 26, 27. I don't have any problems with age. I'm 49 now, but I came to the US with a job, with a visa, again, in a very privileged circumstance, considering how many people come to this country in different situations, right? And I was always this thing like, okay, I'm Mexican, but I live here, but I have this accent, but it's not the typical Mexican accent. I don't look particularly what it's stereotyped as Mexican. So people will ask me if I was from another place. And anyway, so that thing of belonging has been part of my entire life. And I have been dwelling into it and trying to understand better how that works. So that plays a big role today in what I do. I do work with pretty much with all different aspects of a person's identity, from gender, ethnic group, race, etc. But naturally, because I am Mexican, because I speak Spanish, I have coached a lot of people that are from Hispanic descent or Latinas. And I found common themes. One of the things that I think happens a lot is that if you are not part of, or even being part of the community, there's a lack of understanding of the diversity that exists within the Latino or the Hispanic community. So to start with that, right? There's not the same Hispano than Latino. And there are some nuances to that. Hispanic comes from the fact that people speak Spanish. Latino comes from Latin America, but in Latin America, there are countries that don't speak Spanish. So it's a little bit of confusing. And what a lot of, well, the term Latinx was something that was kind of, it's trying to pick up, but there's a lot of people that are against it. So we don't know we're going to end that, right? Because that's part of language and the evolution that we're in. But anyway, so I work with a lot of people from this community, and inside of that, all the diversity that exists, because I came here as an adult with a job in a privileged situation, and my experience as an immigrant is very different than someone who got here at a young age without any say, right? Like that, I have worked with a lot of DACA students, like the dreamers, and what it is like to be in a country that is yours because you have grown up here, but all your roots are from a different place, and that friction that exists, right? So where am I from? I am from here, but I am not documented. But I am not from the other country that my parents came from, because I don't even speak Spanish sometimes, right? Or the language that is spoken there. So common things that I have found is that there is, not always, but there is a sense of, I think it's a combination of guilt and shame that goes on sometimes. And people that have made it, right, in the US feel a little embarrassed to have more than their parents or their relatives, or feel a little bit embarrassed that, well, I can afford air conditioning when others in my original country cannot. So there's that a little bit of guilt and shame. So you cannot be fully who you are, going back to belonging and being fully who because you need to be like navigating this thing. I've worked with a few people, and this is interesting because this was particularly to first generation Mexican Americans who grew up with their parents were farmers, for example. Here in California, there's a big community of them, right? And in other parts of the US. And sometimes they had to be, especially if they were the older kids, they had to take care of their siblings, right? Because parents were working. And a lot of times they're like, I don't want to have a leadership role. I don't want to manage people. I already did what I had to do with my family. I don't want to take care of people anymore, you know?
Right.
So they would decide to not pursue certain paths in their career because they don't want, they already did it, right? And it's a burden, it's not an opportunity. So shifting that mindset, like one thing is taking care of your siblings, leadership and management is something different, right?
Right.
So that is another thing that is common. The other thing that is interesting, in particular, I live in San Diego, so that back and forth crossing the border in car, and I mean Texas and other parts of the US happens, is that it doesn't matter what is your status, right? If you have visa, I mean, I'm a citizen, and every time that I need to cross the border, or either in an airport, like going through customs,
Yeah.
not customs, to immigration,
Mm-hmm.
and having to ask the question like, where are you? Where are you coming from? Where are you going? Why are you in the US? Where are you?
Right.
Where were you out? It always creates a lot of stress, even if you haven't done anything wrong.
Yeah.
It creates that stress, right? The same
Yeah.
that happens if you get pulled over by the police. So
Yeah.
it's this constant worry or stress that you're going to get in trouble for something, even if
Yeah.
you haven't done anything wrong.
I don't have the exact experience that you're describing, but I know what that feels like. I went to Catholic schools from preschool through high school, and I had a lot of Franciscan nuns as teachers. There was always we were going to be in trouble for something. And I think that has more to do with how children were raised, I think, even not that long ago, more than anything else.
Absolutely. Yeah, religion makes
yes,
obviously, right? That plays a
yeah,
big role in that.
yeah. And I don't know to the extent that this is relevant. I thought it was interesting. So when I was in college, I took a barrio studies course. I went to school in Southern California, and what you just touched on or earlier about the diversity within the community was like such a hot topic. And this was like, I don't know, it was probably 1994 or something when I took that course. And there was such complexity around this. And then the professor said at one point, he went back to the Latin side of it. And he says, in Latin, he says, that comes from like Rome. It's like, we're pointing back to Italy on this. It's like, that's not even the,
I mean, it's who's Latin? Who's Latino,
it's like,
right?
why is it even Latin? It's like, why have we come to that? It was, for me, very, very eye-opening. I think all of this is just around awareness. I think sometimes folks want to know what can be done. And I think that where you're coming from is really an internal type of how can we come from the best of who we are and bring that into the world. And going back to what you were saying about someone who is, I don't know, second or third generation, or has just ended up in a different circumstance and now has access to things. What is that line between being boastful? Because you don't want someone to necessarily be boastful, right? Do we protect and not tell anyone of the things that we've gained in our life? I'm curious about this. I've definitely not shared things about my own life for fear that I'm going to make someone feel less than. Have you advised people on how to act in these situations when they're feeling conflicted about their extended family knowing about their success?
Yeah, I don't think that there's a recipe to it. Like I deal with it all the time too. Like I live in San Diego. My mom and my sister live in Tijuana, just 40 minutes away from here. And this last week particularly was super hot, right? Like super hot. And I'm comfortable with my air conditioning, right?
Yes.
And they would say like, oh my God, it's so like we can sleep and the heat and it's like, oh my God, like how do you I think that's something to constant requires navigate it.
Absolutely.
Catch yourself when you're feeling guilty about something and just get well grounded on I mean, at the end of the day, you didn't do anything wrong. At the contrary, you have done a lot of things right to get you where you are, right? So I think that finding the right balance between owning and embracing who you are, what you have, with the humility that comes from, or modesty from where you come from, right? And find the right balance. I mean, sometimes, I mean, I got them a lot of fans, right? To compensate somehow, or like I don't know. I think that it's a hard thing to do, and it's just to catch yourself, because living constantly with this feeling of shame or of guilt is not productive either, right?
Right, exactly. I think this just it pushes us. I mean, this is humanity at work. It's okay to be uncomfortable, and it pushes us to in ways to be better humans, to give back, to really understand what our role is in the broader context. It's all so very, very complicated.
I think we need to also understand that naturally I mean, there's no other way, right? Like we see life through our own perspective, through
Yeah.
our own life,
Yeah.
and our circumstance, without thinking it through, like our first reaction to our circumstance is ours, and
Right.
it can be not great,
Right. Yeah.
but it's ours, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
think that the part that becomes a little bit tricky is how do you share your own circumstances with the right context and
Mm-hmm.
within the right I guess,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, with the right context. What does it say? First country problems versus,
Yes.
right, developing
Yep.
countries.
Right.
So, but understanding, and sometimes it might not be appropriate to share
Right.
some of those experiences and more of
Yeah.
listening.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the part that it's important, is to listen to other people,
Mm-hmm.
with curiosity,
Yes.
and try, because there's no way that you're going to see the life through their
Mm-hmm.
eyes, but
Mm-hmm.
try to get as much understanding of their life so you can get a little
Yeah.
bit of a better sense
Yeah.
of.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think curiosity and staying open, again, not making assumptions, not jumping to conclusions or judgment. You're reminding me that, when I entered this world that I'm in now, management consulting, it's pretty much been my entire career. There were little stints at academic libraries, but, I grew up in the suburbs, Southern California, certainly not coastal Southern California. I was inland, it was hot and uncomfortable to live, but we did have air conditioning. I had all the things. But moving to the Northeast and then landed in a situation where the education and the backgrounds felt quite different, felt very elite. There's
Yeah,
always something that is like,
there's always,
this
yeah,
big
yeah.
difference. And people my age or close to my age would talk about these fantastic trips they had been on, or, and I just, I had no, like, oh my God, I have nothing in common with these people. That's the only place I could go. Like, I just felt like I didn't fit.
Yeah.
Ultimately, many, many years later, I don't think that that's true. I think there is a space for me here. And I would not have ever known that some of those similar trips would have been possible for me. I almost, like we need to be exposed a little bit in order to understand what's possible if,
Yeah.
one is willing to make some changes. And it can be a real challenge to make changes depending on where your roots come from.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's also that mindset, that mentality, right? And sometimes it's not even conscious.
Mm-hmm.
Like I did some workshops with undocumented students, and I started to get interested in that community. I've always been about access. Like I've always been like, okay, you don't speak English, I speak Spanish, I translate for you, right? Like to get people access to things that are important. But one thing, I think it was in 18, when this conversation with the previous administration started about the DACA students and that they were going to close the program and all of that, I started to think about, in any circumstance, even if we are in the most privileged circumstances, because we are human beings, we are going to deal with those things, right? Like, I don't belong here, I am not too pretty, or there's not enough of something, of beauty or intelligence or money or a car. There's always that perspective. We come from that scarcity perspective, regardless of our upbringing.
Yeah.
And I started to think, like, imagine these kids that they're not that kids anymore, right? Like they're in their late 20s, 30s, but their entire life has been about hiding who they are, because who they are is problematic, right? Being careful of who they speak with and what they say, because their parents can get deported at any moment. And that's what started to kind of created this switch in me, because I, as immigrant, I didn't have that issue at all. I mean, it was, my problem was like, okay, the immigrant person, the immigration officer is going to
Ask me
send me
questions.
to, right. And I
Make me
haven't done anything
uncomfortable.
wrong. So,
Right.
but I started to get curious about, wonder what is their experience and what kind of barriers, like mental barriers or limiting beliefs, they have created through their lives about who they are.
Right.
And still, they are finishing careers They are graduating from,
Mm-hmm.
I work with a Latina young woman studying aerospace engineering,
Mm-hmm.
and another studying
Mm-hmm.
linguistics and
Mm-hmm.
engineering and software developer, like still not knowing what there's is their future. They are making progress, right? They're
Yeah.
preparing themselves,
Yeah.
etc. And it just became a fascinating thing for me to start working with them and to see how I can help them in breaking down or breaking through those limiting beliefs, right? Like one thing that was interesting is we started a workshop. There were 15 students, and I asked them the question, do you see yourself as a leader?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was one that said yes,
Hmm.
or that you could have a leadership position was the
Mm-hmm.
question. And I
Mm-hmm.
think one person responded yes. And we went through the training, which is, it's called, the title is Lead by Being You, right? So to the initial point, let's collect all those instances in your life. It doesn't matter how old you are, those instances in your life where you have shown leadership,
Mm-hmm.
some kind of leadership. It might have been you got together with your friends and you went for a ride, and like a bicycle ride or whatever, right? Like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
start to look for those moments where you have shown leadership, where you have felt that you were contributing, that you were.
Yeah.
And at the end, I think it was 80%, not everyone still, but about 80% shifted their perspective that they could see themselves as
Mm-hmm.
leaders.
Yeah. Yeah.
So a lot of that has to do with what we say, what
Right.
our own narrative, right? And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the coaching that I do is with that, is how can we reframe those
Yes.
narratives
Yes.
to make them more empowering.
Mm-hmm.
And if something is not working, know that you can do something about it, right? You
Yeah.
don't have to be the CEO of a company to change something. You don't have to be a politician. You can do it within your
Right.
circle of influence.
Yes. Yes. You told me in the previous conversation about your focus on collaboration. That's really where you like to work with teams, like organizationally, and that fits in with everything else, right?
Yeah.
How does it look? Is this part of your framework at all, or
Yes.
yeah?
I don't think I answered this question at the
Okay.
beginning about my career. So I came to the US and I was working in Mexico in the area of marketing and communications.
Okay.
So I developed a career of 20 something years, 25 or so years in that field. And I was also doing some coaching and training as a side gig. And it's what I love, but in like early 2000, 2002 or so, coaching was not a thing, right? And it was weird actually. Like if you would say like, "Oh, I'm working with a coach," it was like, "What is that?"
Right.
Right?
Right.
The same as a therapist. So
Yeah.
thankfully things have evolved and changed.
Yes.
But I was in this company for 11 years. I had great experiences. I loved there. It was a high tech company. I was in corporate communications. I was the one at that point who wanted to travel to India or to Vietnam or to, I mean, for me was
Yeah.
like the opportunity. A lot
Yeah.
of people in my team saw that as a real threat, so they wouldn't go, right? So I was like, okay, I raise my hand, I go. So I was in charge of the corporate communications program for all of the developing countries in the world. So except for China. And yeah, I mean, from India to Middle East and Africa, Latin America,
Wow.
of course. So
Wow.
I loved that.
Yeah.
And then the company changed and evolved, and then the functions changed. So my function changed too. So I was not that happy at that point. And in 2018, the company restructured and laid off about 3,000 people. So I was one of them, right? So here I am at 45, sitting in my living room saying, like, what I'm going to do. And I have had several instances where people will tell me, you're so good with like you should do coaching, you should do
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
So like, okay, you know what, I'm going to switch careers. I don't want to have anything to do with corporate communications anymore. I don't want to deal with reporters anymore. I am done with that. I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
start to have a direct impact in people. So long answer to get to your question about the framework. So I started to study other things. I got certification on leadership coaching, human resources leadership, the diversity and inclusion. So I started to build something that I wanted to have something more tangible. So I created this framework that it's called authentic inclusive collaboration. And I was very specific about the name because I want it to be authentic, right? People need to see the value in this. This is not something that needs to be done because you have to check a box. You need to really believe in that. So that is the part of the authenticity, and what the authenticity that I bring in as a Latina immigrant, work in technology, etc. Inclusive, well, I want to make sure that everybody is included. And the collaboration, I was careful to not call it leadership, because when we talk about leadership, there's a perception that it's someone else who needs to do it, but not, especially if I'm not in a leadership position, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But collaboration really requires everyone to be involved.
Yeah.
And that is the approach that I take. So inside of this approach, I have 3 pillars for inclusion, which is belonging, like building a sense of belonging, creating spaces that people are empowered to participate, because that was something that I started to look at as I started coaching people. For many years, the conversation was is like, well, we don't have a seat at the table. And then particularly this was specific to gender, right? Well, women started to have a seat at the table, but then they wouldn't take it. They wouldn't participate. They were not empowered to participate, right? So how do you empower people to participate? And the third one is that everybody has an equal opportunity to thrive. So those are the 3 pillars: belonging, participation, and thrive. So I started to look into how can we build really inclusive environments where not everybody is the same. Not everybody participates the same way, right? So we have certain standards, certain molds already, like, okay, if you want to advance in your career, you need to be good at public speaking. Well, guess what? Most people are not good, and they are scared to death to do it.
Yeah.
But I've coached a lot of people that they're conditioned to their next promotion to be them being good speakers. It's going back to fixing something that you're not good at, right? And then because they don't speak in meetings, there's just an assumption that they don't have anything to contribute. Well, a lot of times they have a lot to contribute, but they don't have a space to do so. A meeting a lot of times is not the right space for people to contribute. So I think that it goes to, as a manager or as a leader, to understand who are the people in your team, which are their skills, their strengths, but also what is the best way to empower them to thrive. Not everybody's going to be the same.
Yeah.
And it can go from recognition, right? Some people want to have a big cake for recognition. Some people want to have just an email that says thank you, and others just want to have a bonus.
Yeah.
And expecting any of those is fine.
Yeah.
We need to understand too, right? Like when you are in big corporations, we have been trying to be so effective and so productive that we have standardized certain things.
Yeah.
But when it comes to people, I think that standardizing things is not going to, it's not going to help in what we are talking about.
Yeah, it's complicated. And managers, leaders, how much time are they given? How many of them are given access to this type of training and working with a coach like yourself? So the ability to have the time, the space, the knowledge to do all of these things. And I think too, though, that even if someone was listening and they felt like their boss didn't have these skills, what are the things that they can do for themselves? You might not feel empowered while you're around the table. Like you said, that it might not be the right time. Maybe the context is not quite right, but maybe also it could be part of the individual that they'll be much more effective if they can communicate this some other route, right?
Yes.
So I think that as individual contributors, they can take a route, even if they're not being given the specific instruction to do so, contribute after the fact. And you can reply to the meeting attendees after the fact. But are there other things that you would recommend to the individual contributor navigating their way with bosses that might not be fantastic?
Yeah, you make a great few points. One is a lot of managers are not trained to be managers. And that is the first problem, right? And it creates a conflict because the thing that they were really good at, that got them promoted as manager, they're not using that anymore.
Right.
So there is a transition that needs to happen. And I've worked with a lot of first-time managers who are like, okay, I don't know what I'm doing.
Right.
right? So that is one thing. The other is, and I want to make sure that this is, and I make always emphasis on this, all of this is a two-way street.
Yes.
People are responsible for their careers,
Mm-hmm.
and you need to find a way to support yourself,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And you need to find the courage and the vehicles and the communication to have those conversations where, you know, I don't feel comfortable sharing in front of people. Would you mind if we have a one-on-one afterwards? Or I send you my written thoughts after the meeting, or that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Now, that is not going to happen if the manager doesn't provide that space,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the standard is like, oh, you're going to cause more work. You're going to make things less efficient. I don't have time to read your emails, etc. So there needs to be that both, like, people need to participate, but there needs to be a space for that participation to happen.
Right.
And it's not easy.
Yeah.
It's not easy. I mean, I see it with performance reviews, right? Different ideas about if even like performance reviews are the right way to measure performance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most managers, and I was a manager, and I know I did this, and I saw a lot of my colleagues doing this, is like performance review are pains in the butt,
Yes,
right?
they are. Yes.
It's like nobody has the time, nobody wants to do it. It's like, let's get over this as soon as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what defines the career of people.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you look, and that is the part of the third leg of the pillars that I want, the third pillar is making sure that companies are looking into their systems, their processes, their policies, the way that their behaviors, code of ethics, etc. Because the way that organizations are designed today and the policies and all those procedures are not conducive to be either diverse or inclusive. They're not.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you support the manager who has 10 people that they need to do a performance review for them to have the time for them to sit down and really think things through, to not apply different biases? I had a very interesting exercise with one of my clients. He was working on performance reviews and he had 10 people. And we dedicated, probably was like 4 or 5 sessions for him to work on that. We went one by one person by one person. Like, what are the accomplishments? What are you sure you're giving them the right assessment or rate, or are you comparing them to somebody else, right? Like that contrast effect bias. So it was very interesting. He was able to promote someone who didn't think, he didn't even think about this person as a promotion.
Interesting.
And as we went through, but it required him to sit down, to think, to process, to think slow. I don't know if you know this book, but
I
think
do.
fast and slow.
Mm-hmm.
Get engaged in their slow thinking brain to do this process. And it takes effort. Nobody wants to do that.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of challenges. There are so many challenges, and they're not easy, right? It's a very complex topic, but we need to start somewhere. Like, I think
there's a lot of work to be done. That's
yeah.
for sure. And I know when I listen back to this, I'm going to be making all of these notes about what I need to learn more about. The fact that someone that he never would have considered for promotion ended up revealing him or herself in this process. I mean, that's really something. And the bias and the fact that we never slow down, all of it. I'm going to have to go back. I do have that book. I don't know that I've read it cover to cover.
I know it's hard. That book, it took me, and I didn't read it cover to cover.
It's dense.
But it's worth it. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It's worth it. Yeah.
Yeah. That's fantastic. I like to ask any guest that I have on about what it means to be valued at work. And I think this varies from human to human, but I think it's important to think about. So I'm curious for you yourself personally, like what has that meant for you throughout your own career? How have you known when you've been valued? Have there been times when you didn't feel valued? What have been the markers for you? Anything you could share about that?
Yeah. One thing is that I think that we as individuals need to be clear about that first, right? Because the normal thing that we go to, it's the fast thinking, the thing that is right there, is comparison. So, oh, this person is getting that, I want that, right?
Mm-hmm.
or this person is the, and I want that.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of times those things are not even what we want.
Mm-hmm.
So engaging or slow thinking into what is that I want? How do I want to be acknowledged, recognized? What does it feel to be valued, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that also almost comes together with the belonging, is like you need to also value yourself and you need to value your own work.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yep.
One of my bosses, I put together I mean, it's amazing the amount of growth that I have had in the last 4 years, right? Since I started this new journey as an entrepreneur. But back then I had produced a fantastic event. It was really great. And I put together a report. And my boss would say, it doesn't feel that you're proud of what you produced. The report doesn't show
Mm-hmm.
that you are proud and that you value what you produce, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that made me think like, it was just for me, it was just, okay, it's another event that I need to go through. It's the 10th time that I do this event. I'm over with, like.
Yep.
So there was a particular mentality or mindset about
Mm-hmm.
the report that I had that I was totally unconscious to.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that she said that, it made me think like, you know what? Yeah, I am not putting any value into this. And we had grown. Some of the measurements that we had was about coverage that we had for the event, how many articles were written.
Yep.
And we had doubled or tripled
Hmm.
the previous year.
Hmm.
But it required for me to start looking into like, what are the things that I can show that I am proud about?
Mm-hmm.
And asking myself that question, going through the entire report again.
Mm.
And I was able to find other things.
Mm.
So when it comes to how does each individual want to be valued, I think that it's important for everybody to understand. And that is going to change through your career,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
When you're young, when you're younger in your career, maybe just like you feel valued because you're invited to meetings.
Yeah.
When you're more senior, you don't want to be invited to more meetings.
I know.
That is not the way to show value, right? Is it through a bonus? Is it through the projects that you get assigned to?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In my previous experience, I had all these countries and all these things, and it sounded super fancy. But at the same time, the regions that I was working with had like 10% of the overall budget that we had, right?
Wow.
So there was very little to do with
Yeah.
that. Maybe it wasn't 10%, maybe it was 20, but clearly it was not a priority.
Yeah.
And I wanted to work with Europe or with other regions that are priorities, that you have plenty of money to spend, that you have, or resources, not necessarily money, but you have resources. And it was constantly that struggle, or can I get more budget for this? Can I get this budget approved? Can I go this trip, etc. Right? So that constant struggle, it didn't matter how much I loved what I was doing. There was always this underlying sense like, you know what I'm doing is not really appreciated, is not a priority for the company.
Right.
So I think that is a good thing to understand what people value, right?
Yeah.
And how they want to be valued, and make sure as a manager that everyone in your team touches projects that are relevant to the company, that are priorities for the company.
Yeah.
Right? For some people is that, for some people is having a lot of things to do, for others going to a lot of meetings, for others is not having anything to do. So,
it's, yes, there's so much in that. There's so much value there, to things to think about, reflect on. And the first thing you said, I think, is one to really go back to the description, the experience you were giving about your report, and how you went through the process to kind of pull out for yourself what mattered to you, and that you were fortunate to have a boss to ask you those questions. But that is an exercise that any person could do on their own. Ask themselves, what are the elements of what I did today or over the whatever that really, that you added your whatever it is,
right,
you added impact in that thing.
Yeah. And one thing, I'm actually working right now, I'm preparing for a training that I'm going to do on goal setting, and it's part of their performance review program. And one of the things that it's important to understand is you have accomplishments, right?
Yeah.
And some accomplishments might be, ideally they're measurable, but there are a lot of things that goes behind the scenes to get to that.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
And that is the part that matters.
Mm-hmm.
What challenges did you have to overcome? What are the
Mm-hmm.
things that you
Mm.
had to stretch yourself
Yeah.
to make it happen? Did you
Mm-hmm.
have to push back on certain things? Like, look at the process that got you to that accomplishment and look at the things that you are proud about yourself
Yeah.
that you were able to overcome to get to that.
Yeah.
So that reflection is not very common. It takes time, it takes effort. I a lot of times, and this is pretty much I suggest to all my clients, and I leave it here if you want to suggest it to your listeners,
Yeah.
is to have a, maybe it's a notebook or something that it's physical. It's not in your memory, but physical, that you can write down frequently things that you're proud about yourself,
Mm-hmm.
things that you accomplished, things that you did, things that you said, and you start collect all those memories or those accomplishments, revisiting them constantly, reading them constantly creates that mindset also to our brain to focus on positive things and
Yes.
not focusing on negative, because we also
Yeah.
know most of the time we're focusing on all the negative stuff and then we
Yep.
forget all the positive.
Yep.
So but
Yeah.
we need to use resources outside of our memory, because our memory is not going to be reliable in moments when we need them.
Right. Absolutely. There's way too much stored in our brains that's not helping us.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
say, right? It's our worst enemy is our own brains
Yeah.
or own
Yeah.
mind.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, this has been fantastic. Such a rich discussion. I very much enjoy talking with you, Yennie.
Me too. Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
where can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I have Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn,
Hmm.
Y Rautenberg
Hmm.
or Rautenberg Coach.
I will repeat those also in the description that I write up and put them everywhere else so it'll be clear. And I'm sure that you're on LinkedIn and you may have even said that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
LinkedIn. Normally I use LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. So those are my
Yeah.
three main platforms.
All right. Right. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. I've appreciated this very much.
Me too. Thank you for the space, and I look forward to talking to you again.
All right. Thank
Good
you.
luck with everything.
All right. Bye.
Okay, bye.
Wow, wow, wow. There you have it. Episode 17 is in the books. I'm just overwhelmed by the awesome conversations that I get to have with people who are doing things in corporate spaces that are so meaningful as it relates to helping people have a better experience and really like getting into the weeds about it. So I just want to thank Yennie and the podcasting experience for allowing this kind of thing to happen. A few things from this episode. One is we mentioned the book Thinking Fast and Slow, and I have it here in front of me. It is by Daniel Kahneman. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. It's Daniel Kahneman. Thinking Fast and Slow. And it's true. I have not read it cover to cover, but I have read parts of it. And maybe I need to go back to it. A few other things. And these are really, I don't know that we had answers or formulas here, but we definitely had some things to reflect on. When you think about your accomplishments, or if you're a boss and you're thinking of the accomplishments of your direct reports, consider the challenges that you had to overcome to get there. How were you stretched? That's really where the meat is when you're considering accomplishments. I loved what Yennie shared in terms of helping people with the review process, and that, you know, managers complain about it and it is a pain. And again, this is people's career. And Yennie also said that individuals need to take control of their own careers. They need to map their direction. So there's a spectrum here. Yes, we need managers to do a good job, and we also need individuals assuming some, initiative in their own development. Another idea here was, how are we ensuring that there are options for contribution? And this one, I certainly don't know the answers to either. I think I've seen weird things happen in corporate situations, but I'm not sure that I've seen a lot of examples of many opportunities for contribution, or many ways that people at a meeting or sitting around a table or leading a meeting are really working to draw out those who are not speaking up, or providing alternatives for outreach and contribution elsewhere. But maybe I'm missing some of it. I know I've certainly reached out to meeting organizers after the meeting to share ideas, thoughts, contributions, etc. Also, this idea around, what does it feel like to belong? This is a key component to the work that Yennie does. And she's saying that, we need to foster an environment. I believe this is what she was suggesting, that we need to foster an environment where people can feel like they belong, but also that this too is something that we need to do as individuals. We need to own who we are, our value, what we bring, and just kind of own this belonging. And this too is something that I certainly haven't figured out. And I'm curious if other people feel this. I think a lot of people feel weird sometimes in corporate, but maybe they're not thinking about it as much as I am. I know that I felt like I belonged in just about every restaurant I ever worked in. I definitely felt like I belonged. And who knows, maybe that was just because I knew that people had maybe similar backgrounds, or we were working on something else and it just felt like there was this kind of mission behind the effort. I'm not sure I've ever really felt this in corporate. I've noticed sometimes that I'll get a startled look from people sometimes, especially when I feel like I'm being my true self. And I'm like, what is that? Like, do people not know how to respond to me? Or maybe they're just kind of choosing not to and are kind of surprised. Maybe they had me in a box and I'm not responding the way they expected to. It certainly makes me feel like I don't belong. But just because I feel like I don't belong, it doesn't mean that I don't belong in truth and reality. I don't know. This is so complex. Where does it go beyond perception? And, I work on this all the time. I mean, I know some of this is just me, but I know that a lot of other people feel this way too. Now, kind of the sticky part that I wanted to get into a bit here is that I'm a little bit self-conscious, actually more than a little bit self-conscious, that I compared my experience growing up and going to Catholic schools with Yennie's experience of crossing the border, Tijuana into San Diego, because it's really not comparable. Of course, I have no idea what it is to be someone with brown skin, who has an accent and coming over the border and just being questioned, and knowing that you didn't do anything wrong, but not sure that that was going to matter, right? And I brought up my experience in schools, this constant sense of authority, expecting that I was doing something wrong. So at this point, it's almost like I have to separate, because I cannot speak to Yennie's experience coming over the border, but I wanted to speak to what happens when someone is brought up in an environment where they're being questioned and it's assumed that they're always doing something wrong. This is something that Martin Seligman talks about. He is one of the pioneers of positive psychology. And he talks about this being true for himself, and that when he grew up, there was definitely this mentality of, what are the kids doing wrong? And it's very endemic of certain generations. This was really something that happened in my school life. And again, the nuns that taught were very, very much looking to correct constantly behavior. And it is how some kids continue to be raised today, but I have seen a lot of changes in this. But when you enter a space every day where the expectation is that you're naughty, this doesn't exactly lend itself to building healthy self-esteem. What it's doing is building healthy compliance. And we do still have command and control work environments. When I talk to Nancy Roberts, I think that's the next episode to drop, we talk about this a little bit more. You're just avoiding trouble all the time, right? You're avoiding trouble that you're not even sure what it's going to be. It might be defined for you in a new way tomorrow than it did, today. You're walking on eggshells and you're avoiding. You're in an avoidance mindset because you don't want to get in trouble. And I have not dug into the research on this. I said in a prior episode that I kind of resist digging into research on things that I know are just, it's the human experience. I mean, we see this played out in movies all the time. These are, archetypes. This happens. We have lived this experience. Those who have grown up with everyone around them expecting that they're doing wrong all the time, it ends up affecting a very defensive exterior. And when we are defended most of the time, like during our formative years from age 5 until 14, we project that defensiveness into the world around us. That energy gets projected. We end up less approachable as a result of this. We have a hard time being objective or even neutral. We're just constantly in protection mode because we don't want to be accused of doing something wrong. I'm simplifying this, but it's true. We have a hard time spelling out even what a better outcome would be. We're not in a contribution mode. We're in a protection mode. We might assume that authority can only see us as troublemakers. We see policy, we see initiatives, anything that a company is doing, maybe we see it set up to hold us back or keep us down, where that might not be it at all. especially relevant, individuals in the workplace who might have had this type of conditioning have a really hard time, again, spelling out what a better outcome might be. We've never been encouraged to even think this way. I wanted to call this out because, especially in the United States, we have this pull ourselves up by the bootstraps mentality. It's a fine mentality, I guess. This idea that you can change your experience by changing your mindset. I believe that's true. But to begin to break down the walls of what has been built up, over many, many years, this form of protection, this conditioning, it's not an overnight turnaround. Most people don't even realize that they're being defensive. This is stuff that is in our subconscious mind. You don't just flip a switch on it, right? We don't have this contributing mindset if this is not how we have been brought up. And again, I'm kind of speaking black and white, and I know that there's all sorts of shades of gray, but we have to put language around things, and sometimes language feels confining. But we can have very, very, very defensive perspectives. I have to say, being married has been one of the ways that this has begun to shed for me in my own life, that my husband has been the one to point out to me in a way that I could actually hear, even though it didn't always feel great. I could hear him tell me when I was being defensive. Again, it didn't always feel great, and I resented him for even saying it. But it was something that I had to begin to crack through in order to begin a whole other process of growing and journeying. And it's still my default behavior. It's still something that I work to overcome constantly. And who knows what percentage of the population could actually be in this kind of defended mode at most times. But it always seems to me when I'm at work that other people it seems to be much easier for them to engage and to create ideas and newness and growth and have that kind of leaning in mindset. And I think I do portray it, but underneath it's like I'm holding back this sense of defensiveness, and it can be just very, very frustrating. So I just had to say some things around that. I'm sure there's more to come on this. And the broader context here is that we are all dealing with conditioning in some way, shape, or form from our formative years, things that are influencing who we are in the workplace, how we're reacting to things around us, our ability to lean in, our ability to be who we want to be. And it's complicated. And where can we get feedback? How can we be open? How can we build awareness? A key aspect of building that awareness is through feedback, and feedback is a pain in the ass. And if we're not getting it from husbands or from bosses or from coworkers, it's too bad. And it's hard. I hate it. I absolutely hate the feedback, but it's where we grow. It's how we change. And Yennie was just fantastic. Follow her. Again, she's on Instagram, she's on LinkedIn, and she's also on Facebook. You can look her up. She's Rautenberg Coaching. As always, please send any comments or messages my way. You can send a recorded message to linda@workdopepod.com. That's linda@workdopepod.com. Until next time, this is Linda Stacy signing up for Work Dope. Bye-bye.